Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Dais, a podcast about the stories taking place in and around El Paso County, Colorado. I'm your host, Scott Anderson, and today I am joined by Dr. Jervaise Pileggi, an adjunct faculty member with the University of Denver, and Melody Alvarez, the Director of Programming for the Pikes Peak Library District. How are the two of you doing today?
Great, thank you.
Great, thanks.
Great. Well, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Before we get started, I do want to say that if listeners are interested in more stories about people doing good in and around El Paso County, or hearing from county leadership about local government priorities and how they operate, you can find additional episodes of this podcast on your podcast platform of choice. But to get started today, I first wanted to say congratulations to the two of you. You are in episode 100 of the podcast. I mean, come on, that's kind of a big deal, right?
Yay. Yeah, that's
right.
very exciting. Yeah.
Right. So I'm actually really excited about how this conversation is going to go, because when I initially started the podcast for the county, I really wanted it to focus on storytelling and how stories, not only affect people living in an area, but how they can help educate and bring knowledge to people. And hopefully I've been able to do that over the previous 99 episodes of the podcast, but we're going to be able to focus a lot more on that today. So I'm really excited for what the conversation has in store for us. But to start things off, I was wondering if each of you could give a bit of background about yourselves. Jervaise, let's start with you.
Yes. So I grew up in rural Colorado in El Paso County, and so I'm a Colorado native, which I think is unique and important. I think it's an important thing to acknowledge our Colorado people, especially this time of year when, everything is so local centric, but we have a lot of visitors, which I appreciate. I got my doctorate in curriculum and instruction, and I have a real profound passion in working with gifted students. I've been an educator for a long time, and really the importance of reading has also been so important to me foundationally. My bachelor's degree was in English, and so reading's always been this thing that I think shapes people, and I think the power of reading is it can come and go, and stories can come and go in your life, and I think there's something beautiful about that, about reading a story, going away for a little bit, and then coming back. And so,
yeah, that's great. Melody, how about you? Some background about yourself.
So I am not from Colorado. I grew up in Northwest Indiana, and that's where I decided to become a librarian. I worked at a library, and my original plan was to be an elementary teacher, but I saw the fun stuff that librarians get to do, a children's librarian, and so that's where I started working. But I met my husband. He was in the Army, and we got here to Colorado. So I have a 7-year-old. Oh my gosh.
Hey, I've got 4 kids. I mess up their ages all the time. It's totally
I only
okay.
have one, and I shouldn't mess up. But I have a 7-year-old, and so everything that I've learned becoming a children's librarian, I applied to raising her. And it's amazing to see what talking and reading and singing does to a child and that brain development, and entering kindergarten at a 5th grade reading level. And so I'm here to help parents get their children into reading and the importance of reading, and like you said, the storytelling. Every time a child reads something, they get something different out of it, whether it was at age 5 and then they read it again at age 10. And so I just really love and encourage reading and talking with your little ones.
Yeah, I love that.
So, Melody, you are with the Pikes Peak Library District here locally. Can you share some background about the library district itself and sort of how they operate here in the region?
Yeah, so we have an amazing library system here in the Pikes Peak region, and we provide so many opportunities for everyone. What I love about public libraries is that everything is free, no matter what. And here at Pikes Peak, we provide programming for 0 to 500. But we
I want to meet that 500-year-old that
Right.
you're doing programs for, by the way.
Well, you'll have to go to our local history room. No.
That's fair. That's fair.
But and so we provide the programming and also just help with finding legal support. If you're starting a business, I mean, whatever you need, you could go to your library. I like to think of it as the community hub, because we're connecting patrons with local organizations, and we could find whatever they're looking for. We do a prenatal series where we really talk about the importance of early literacy, but also what's in the community and who can you go to if you need support on postpartum or sleep or anything like that. So I like to think of us as like that branch for the organizations in our community and our patrons.
And in your specific role as the director of programming, what is it that you do for the library?
So my role specifically is just overseeing the team that provides all the programming for the district. So we do centralized programming where my team develops the programs and then the branch staff do the programs. Okay. And so it's a big role, but we don't just do programming. Like everything you see, the LIP guides, the resource guides, the website stuff, like that's all coming from my team. Reading list, and we're making sure we're reading the books that we're putting on the reading list. And, it's just a lot of fun stuff that we get to do. That's
awesome. So libraries, obviously, were a big part of your life, pretty much your entire life, it sounds like. They were a very big part of my life growing up. I come from a single-parent family, and libraries were part of that escapism, right? And just, again, storytelling in general, big part of that escapism. Jervaise, for you, how have libraries been a part of your life?
So I think that library systems are really important. I grew up in rural Colorado where we didn't have access to libraries. Like the library district came through a bookmobile, and the ability to check those books out and have those conversations with that librarian every other week and talk about the things that you love. And they would pull books for you. I think that's a magical thing. And I think that librarians have this unique and special opportunity to help guide students and children to find the books that are going to give them joy in their lives. And there's a beauty in that. And books allow us, like you said earlier, to kind of escape and go to different worlds and experiences. And when you're, for me at least, when I was a girl growing up in the country of Colorado, like it's an escape to pretend like you could be a princess in a castle or something. And so I think there's a beauty in that. And as we navigate this time where book banning is happening more and more frequently, I think it's also important to acknowledge that not every book has to be right for every family, but it should still be available. And it's important for parents to have conversations with their kids about it. They'd have a conversation with them if they were watching a TV show. So it doesn't make sense to me to take a book away from every kid when it's not right for just one family. And so, and I've seen that happen. And I've actually been a part of conversations where there have been 5 adults in the room. And I'm like, has anybody read this book besides me that's under fire right now? No. Then let's have a real, you go read it. And then we can talk about whether or not this is appropriate for my classroom library. Because I firmly believe that kids need access to books and a wide variety of books, because not everybody reads the same thing, and how boring it would be if we did.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've heard both of you talk about a little bit is how every time we read something, we get something different out of it. I experienced this with my favorite book is Jurassic Park, as it turns out. And which is weird because I first read that when I was 7 years old, which was very fortunate for me because the movie came out the next year. And because I'd read the book, my mom let me see the movie when I was 8. Very, very exciting. I was super pumped. So, but it's one of those books, especially because I read it at such a young age originally. Every time I go back to it, it's like reading it for the first time almost, because I do get something new out of it every time. Kind of taking that and spreading it more broadly to storytelling in general. Let's talk about how getting something different out of a story, whether it be a book, a movie, an experience, whatever, is such a cool way to experience life. Jervaise, I kind of want to start with you on that one.
I think there's a profound power in stories, that our lived experiences are what shape us, and stories give us glimpses into a future that we wouldn't know otherwise, right? Like, I've never been to China, so reading a book about it is my only experience, and I have to trust the author's integrity in creating that, which has also been, that's been under fire in the past. But I do think that, there is a power in the stories that we experience and how they shape us. People always say, what's your favorite books? And I always say, it's Wuthering Heights and Harry Potter. And I can't, there's such a weird, that's a weird partnership. But I remember I read Harry Potter at 14 the first time, and the first 4 books were out. And I just would read all 4 of them and restart because it was such this beautiful thing. And as I reflect back as an adult, I can say I was searching for friends, and I was searching for these core values that these books had in them. And as an adult, I reflect on that, and I'm like, that's why I kept going back. But it was fun, and it was an escape, and there is a beauty in that. And as I have read them again in my late 30s, and I'm like, oh, I can kind of sympathize with the teachers a whole lot more than I ever did as a child. I was like, man, they are very naughty. But, I think there's a beauty. And as I watch my little 4-year-old, as we read stories together and her experience it, I think that there is a joy in what are those stories and how do we share them? And why do we take the time to do that? You know what I mean? I think there's a call for more diverse books in the world and more exposure, and I think that that's super important too. I want to make sure that even as a parent, I'm reading diverse books to my 4-year-old, because I think she needs different perspectives. Because again, going back to what I said earlier, I've never been to China, so when I read Forbidden City, I was like, oh, this is my understanding of this life experience at this time. And I think that's the power of all mediums and storytelling, whether it's an audiobook or a book or a movie or a documentary. It is somebody giving you a glimpse of their life that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I think there's a real beauty and a power in that is important.
And I would add oral storytelling.
Oh, yeah.
Because we're passing down traditions from family to family, and that's generation of doing that, and that's where it all stems from. And so I don't want that to be lost. And so it's really cool that anytime, families could do that with each other, just telling stories. I remember as a young child, my mom telling stories, and not reading from a book, but just orally telling us stories. And I still remember that. And, I do that with my daughter now. We do story starters. I'll start one sentence, you do the next one, and see what story we could come up with. So just making reading and storytelling fun is really important as well for all ages.
So that's it. I completely agree. We do a lot of the same where we'll kind of all sit in a circle and do the story starters where, I'll say, a couple sentences, and then, the 5-year-old will say a couple sentences, and it's completely changed course by then. And, and then so on and so forth around. But no, it's a really fun activity to be able to do that and see kind of where everyone's mind is at, right? Because they'll all sort of share, what they think about, maybe what was told before, but just maybe what they're thinking about in general, and express it in that type of storytelling. It's really, really interesting to see where my kids go with that. So less of an individual perspective, but more the community perspective. Why is storytelling in a whole community such a valuable tool for people? Melody, we can start with you on that one.
I would say it's so valuable because you really get to know who's in your community and really get to learn the area. Someone who's not from Colorado, when I meet natives and just hearing about Colorado and El Paso County and, how big it's grown and just the history of everything, that is so important. Because then I think people really value more of the community and see how important it is for everyone. So I would say it builds the community more.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that when generations pass on, that we have we can lose such valuable insight and information that I think are so important to who we are collectively and why we are the way we are, right? Like how our city has even evolved, and the changes I've seen in my life here are pretty dramatic. And when my mom talks about, Powers being like a dirt road, I mean, it's it's flabbergasting to even think that that's like, not more than like 45 years ago. And now it's like a superhighway. So how would we know that if we didn't tell stories, right? How would we remember all these little nuanced things that in the moment don't feel important, but long term shape who we are and shape our understanding and our perspectives as a community? And I think that there is a beauty and a value in capturing that in some way or form, whether that's orally or written down, just so that, the next generation is aware of why we've done what we've done and where we've come from.
And that's why I love public libraries, because of our local history and genealogy departments. I mean, all the photographs and documentation from local history. I have a picture when I bought my house and my house was built in the 90s. So this was probably, late 80s, dirt road. Voyager wasn't even fully developed. And I got that from my local history department. And it's so neat to see, like, this is how it looked back then and just how the growth has gone. So I think it's really important. And that's one way that people learn about the community, is just going there and learning about Pikes Peak and, how the first person who hiked Pikes Peak, or, just little things like that. It's so important and cool to learn.
Yeah, and Colorado Springs, it's like a deceptive city, right? It feels like it's small, but it's really big, but it's really small. I mean, it's all the things and like this dichotomous relationship, but there are such wonderful things. Like when you think of how the zoo even came about, it was like, those are Spencer Penrose's animals. Like they had to send them somewhere. He couldn't have giraffes roaming around anymore. And so, it's just funny when you think of things like that. And like now it's, I think it's ranked number 4 in America right now.
That zoo is awesome.
It's amazing. Yeah, we're members. But so, as I even tell my daughter those stories, it's funny. I'm like, do you know that this used to just like walk wildly? And, it's, and like that seems like, wow, that was so long ago, but it wasn't really. It is kind of closer to 100 years now, but still, it's interesting to see how things evolve over time. And I think if we don't keep those stories, if we don't have those anecdotal things to share with people, like that's where the beauty is, right? Like you can say, Powers was a dirt road at one point, Voyager didn't exist. But when you have like the anecdotes of like, no, like that's where like coyotes were running wild, it just brings a different view and a different lens on it when you think about it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, especially when I'm talking to my own kids about that sort of thing, it, kind of kicks off their imagination, right? And that's when we get those really cool, like, story time incidents where, they go from here to there. But another cool thing about having both of you specifically in for this conversation is both of you focus on a different area, at least in my opinion, and from a storytelling perspective, where Jervaise, you focus more on the adult side of that and how adults share and learn from storytelling, and then Melody, you on the youth side of things. So I'd be interested to hear both of your perspectives on the adult side and the youth side of how storytelling really helps those individuals evolve. Let's start with the youth with you, Melody. Can you talk to me about that a little bit?
So for children, first 5 years, most important, brains developing. That's when you really want to make sure you're reading and talking and singing, because that's going to bring the love of reading and literature and language. So those are the most important years. And so, we really encourage parents to begin at birth, because once a child learns or, just explores with books, they're going to love it. Their imagination is going to grow. There's so many skills that they learn with reading, whether it's problem solving or critical thinking or just building your imagination, building your vocabulary. And that's going to stem them to become readers as children, teens, and then adults. And so, I always get sometimes, well, my toddler's too busy. They don't want to sit down and read a story. Well, of course not. Toddlers should be on the run, but they're listening, right? So if you're telling a story and you're roaring like a dinosaur, they're going to stop in their tracks and they're going to look back and they're going to come and look at the pictures. So as long as the storyteller is engaging, then you're going to get that child's attention. But, if they're not introduced to reading, then they become those reluctant readers. And we always say there's one book out there that will grab you. So I think in your white paper you mentioned there's so many, life's too short, there's so many good books or something like that. And that's true. Like if you don't like a book, put it down after so many pages and move on, because it's so important to find what you like, read what you like, to keep it going. And even those reluctant readers keep trying audiobooks, magazines, anything. Parents will often say, my child doesn't like to read, so we're not going to read. And it's like they just haven't found the right thing. And then to touch on, let them read what they want to read. If it's a graphic novel, let them read the graphic novel, because at least they're reading. And that's what we want. We want them reading.
Yeah, what's actually really funny about that is you're like describing my 9-year-old right now. He loves reading, but he does the thing where he'll read the first couple chapters of a book and then put it down and move on to another book. And for my wife and myself, who are a little bit more your standard book readers, I guess you would say, it like drives us nuts, right? We're just like, why can't you just finish the book? And he's like, well, I didn't like it. I'm like, okay, well, that makes sense, but why don't you finish the book, right? How do you know if you don't like it? He's like, well, I read like 20 pages and it wasn't interesting. I'm like, well, it's hard to argue with that, right? Yeah. But like, he has learned that is like an acceptable way to consume books. And that's something like when I was a kid was not acceptable. I was like, no, I need to finish the book even if I don't like it or not, especially when it came to, high school reading classes. But, it's just one of those things where my brain didn't really think about that as an option when I was a kid. And it's cool to see how, and again, he's into like more of like the graphic novel type of stuff where, he sees the panels with the pictures and like the people like with the dialogue boxes, right? Instead of like your standard books. But I'm like, he tears through those things like crazy. So, he's reading a lot, but it's just different than how I experienced it. So, but my daughter, on the other hand, is a lot more of that like traditional, like, even if I start a book and I don't like it, I'm going to finish it because I need to know how it ends, right? And so you have those more like traditional story consumers, I guess. So it's really interesting to see how they're both developing from a story consuming perspective, because it is different and it's, I guess, a little bit unexpected from, how I thought it was going to go.
Well, and that's why, sometimes boys could be reluctant readers, and it's just they haven't found what they wanted, or parents are telling them you have to read this.
We're trying not to, okay? We're working on that.
You're doing a great job of letting them do their own thing.
Yeah.
I think the best thing you can do is also cultivate with your daughter this idea of like, you don't have to complete it. Mm-hmm. We can look up the ending.
Yeah,
like, you know what I mean? Like, there are plenty of books that adults don't finish where I'm like, I just really needed to know how that ended, but I can't invest the next 300 pages in my life.
A lot easier to do now than it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago when I was their age, right? Trying to look up the ending was very difficult. It's like you had to know somebody who had finished the book if you want to do that. Or, flip to the last 20 pages and try and understand like how it connected with whatever you had read before, right?
Or cliff notes.
Or
yeah,
those were strongly discouraged in my house. But yeah, no, totally understand. So from the adult perspective, Jervaise, can you share a little bit about that?
I think there's a challenge for adults. And so in the research that I did, my participants were all pretty avid readers as children, and up through high school. And then when they got a lot of hard classes for the first time, they kind of put reading to the side through college. And then as adults, and they kind of embraced it again for the most part. Most of them did. And sometimes that went away a little bit with kids. Sometimes it didn't. But what I found with them and with my own experiences is just having the opportunity to engage in books at different paces and stages in your life, right? And I think adult readers, they know what they like and they know what they don't like. And, the stat that always breaks my heart is that, like, the average adult doesn't even read a book a year anymore or something like that. I mean, it's like, that breaks my heart. And I'm like, but it's because we kind of beat the joy of reading out of them, right? Like and I say this as a secondary English teacher, like, I know that some of the books we have kids read, and when I was a teacher, I always did a contemporary and a classic. And so it was always like a partnership. We would finish a classic and then we go to a contemporary book, because I think that while I do want every kid to have understanding of Shakespeare or whatever, I also think that's not what they're going to read for pleasure when they get old, unless they're going to be an English major, then they're going to read it for pleasure. But I think that they are, I think adult readers also now have so much more options than especially if you're in your 30s or older than that. Like, the amount of fiction has, like, quadrupled, right? Like, there are so many things, and it's, it's beautiful to see, like, things like Book Talk. I don't actually have TikTok, but I know Book Talk's a thing. But, just this idea of, like, if you like this book, you'll like this book. If you like this, you'll like this. And I think it takes away, for some people who can't get to a library, it gives them this opportunity to say, like, oh, I did like this book in high school, so I'm going to like these modern retellings. And I think that's what I found with my adult readers that I spoke with through my research. The other thing is that they are mostly using audiobooks, because you can multitask, right? One of my favorite quotes from my research was, one of my participants said that she loved audiobooks because they're not as greedy of her senses. And so she can drive a car, she can grocery shop, she can wash dishes. They can do all those things while listening to a book. And I think if you can find a medium that is important to you, I think that's good. And I think it also comes over time, right? Like, I think your first audiobook has to be a good one. Mm-hmm. The very first audiobook I tried, I was like, this is not working for me. And so to be like, this is not going to be a good fit. But I think so many, like you said earlier, in our generation, especially, and probably the generation right below us, there was just this push to finish every book, right? It was like, I call it like the accelerated reader drama, but it was just like, I've started a book, I must get my points, I know
exactly what you're talking about. I was in the accelerated reader program. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and so it's just, it cultivated this, like, fear in kids of, like, and now adults of, like, I can't not finish this book, I must finish it, I've started it, I invested 30% of this book, so but I think now adults, if they can just be like, oh, I can just drop that. It's like a television show. If you don't like it,
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, you will stop. And so this idea of, like, we could do the same thing with books. And I think that's what I found with my participants when we talked about, like, engaging in books over your lifespan. And it's so profound. And this idea of, like, my research actually involves specifically using books to meet your social emotional needs without the need of discussion. And so this idea, I call it self-determining bibliotherapy. And so reading the books that you need in the moment, either overtly or covertly, whether you know you need it or not, but gravitating towards certain things to help you get through life. And I think that's what adults do. I think adults naturally, they'll read a nonfiction if they need help being a good parent, or they'll read, if they feel unfulfilled in life at a job, they might read about a whole different career path. And I think there's a beauty and a power in that, like, just this idea of exposure, right? Because that's what storytelling is, right? It's exposing us to different ideas and concepts.
And seeing a glimpse in other people's lives, like you said, you know, if they're struggling with their career, but they're reading a book about someone who loves a different career path or not, we call that mirrors and
windows, yeah.
In the library world. You know, the importance of having these books so that other people could either identify with the story or just see a glimpse into other people's lives.
Yeah.
But I also like how you touched on audiobooks, because on the youth side, you know, oftentimes caregivers may not want their child to listen to audiobooks thinking it's not the same as reading. And it is. You know, it's so good for the brain.
And especially for an auditory learner, right?
Yes.
Like it's good for them if you can ever partner it. Like I 100% tell parents, especially parents with kids with like a learning disability, like partner read, have the audiobook while you're looking at the words. I think that's powerful.
Yeah, very true.
So both of you have touched on it just a little bit, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit more. How has storytelling been a valuable aspect of your own lives and seeing yourself growing up and learning about stories and sharing stories for yourself? How has that affected both of you?
So books, we were a family that didn't have a ton of money, but books were something that were always prioritized in our family. I remember I won a fire extinguisher contest. Why was that a thing? I don't know. Thank you, 90s curriculum. But I got a gift card to Walden Books at the Citadel Mall way back in the day. And I remember buying A Wrinkle in Time. And I remember thinking like, oh, this is my jam. Like, this is a smart girl who knows what she's doing. Like, I felt seen and validated. But my mom always valued reading, even though she was dyslexic in the 60s when girls weren't dyslexic, they just told her she was lazy. She was like, I can read and I'll teach myself how to read. And so I remember there were always like rules in our family, right? Before we could watch TV, we had to have played outside and we had to have read a book. And so, just this idea of reading, and it was just so around me. It felt so natural. Like my grandmother read all the time. There were always books on tables. Sometimes it led to me, like my aunt gave me The Flowers in the Attic at 10, which not an appropriate book for a 10-year-old. But, I think to the point where I was like, Mom, I think there's something wrong in this book. I'm really just confused. And she was like, what has happened here? But just this idea of like, the stories that are told, I think, are important. And I think it's okay to allow serial reading, because my adult participants talked about this idea of like reading a series or reading some kind of idea, especially in childhood. My sister and I went through this phase where we read like every Fear Street book published. Yeah. And I like looking back, and I do love true crime as an adult. So, I mean, I guess it's not that weird, but it's very weird that like, at like 10, 11 years old, we were just reading about these like teenage murders on the regular. And so, but my mom wasn't like, that's alarming. She was just like, that's fine. Go ahead and read it. Like if it, and it, they're just silly little stories in retrospect. But I think part of it is we always had conversations. What's happening in your book? Like at part of our dinner conversation was, what are you reading right now? And like, how's that doing? And my husband and I model that even with our 4-year-old now. Like we're both reading dramatically different things, but we take the time to talk about like, yeah, this is weird in my book or whatever. And our daughter's like, well, whatever. I mean, she doesn't know, but she does know that I'm listening to audiobooks. Like, 'cause sometimes she'll be like, can I listen to? And I'm like, not this story, honey.
Maybe the next one.
Yeah, maybe the next one will be appropriate for you. But yeah.
Well, and you touched on a lot of good points there, and one specifically of the bonding that we have when we're reading with our children. I remember going to the library with my mom all the time and getting books, summer reading books and everything like that. And so I'm trying to do that with my daughter now, and she just devours books. I mean, we go through so many books in a day. Like I said, she's 7, and she's into chapter books. But as a parent, I'm careful with that because, yes, she knows how to pronounce the words, how to read the words, and I could easily give her Harry Potter. But that's scary, like as you get deeper into that series where I'm like, I don't think I'm ready for her to read that yet. And so I choose carefully what we pick for her because she's still 7. And so I encourage parents out there that if you do have an avid reader at a young age, 5, 6, 7, choose chapter books that you're reading with them, because they're going to read through it because they know how to read, but they might not understand, comprehend, or know the vocabulary. So taking that time to ask questions during, open-ended questions during reading. And I love what you mentioned about at dinner time. Dinner time conversations start young, right? And if we're sitting at the dinner table talking about our day or what we're reading, that's going to grow when the child becomes a teenager. So we don't have to worry about, hopefully they'll still talk to us and tell us things. We won't have to worry about what they're reading because we're instilling that good background and those good morals, and that all comes at the dinner table, I think. So,
yeah, my favorite storytelling of my childhood is after every meal, we would sit at the table for, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, just my grandparents telling us stories of their childhood or my mom's childhood. And there is just such a wonderful connection in that to coming back to that idea of storytelling is I do think it's around the table. I do think it's around a fire. I think it's, in these spaces where you share your lived experiences and your funny little stories and your anecdotes that you wouldn't know otherwise. And I think as you get older and your parents face mortality and your grandparents are, leaving, I think it's even more important to treasure those times. I think that's the beauty of storytelling too, right?
Yeah. One of my favorite things that we get to do, we talked about a little bit, is when you read a story with a child or even with someone else, you're reading at the same time, hearing what they have to say about it, right? Because what my daughter thinks about a book is going to be different from what I take from the book. What my wife takes from it is going to be different from my take from it. And so when you have those conversations and share those stories that you're experiencing together, learning those different perspectives or seeing it from that different perspective, right? Because, I learn things from my kids all the time about things that I may have overlooked or may have missed, or details that they picked out that I didn't really focus on, right? And, take that more than just a specific book, but in life in general, right? There are going to be things that people see and experience and, have their own opinion on based off how they experienced it. And being able to listen to that feedback can really go a long way in helping you to actually understand something instead of just understanding it in the way that you were sort of experiencing it for yourself. So it is really cool to have those conversations at the dinner table or, when you're reading a book together and, in the moment being able to say, oh, what did you think about that right there? And, hearing what they have to say and you're like, oh, wow, didn't even think about that. Or being able to add oh, interesting. This is how I thought about it, or this is what I got from it. And seeing the same thing from them, oh, I didn't even see that, didn't think about that before. So, more broadly from a storytelling perspective, to me, that's one thing that's really cool and fascinating as a community, as sort of a larger population, is experiencing the same thing in a moment and seeing what people get out of it. And then trying to understand wow, that's what you got out of that? That's interesting because this is what I got out of that. And, sometimes they line up and sometimes they don't. And boy, why is that? And, how are we going to figure that out together? Right. And, that's again, Jervaise, going back to you from the adult side of things. That's one of the things that I thought was really interesting in looking at your research is just how people experience something. And this even goes back to the beginning where we talked about consuming the same thing more than once, how it can change over time.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's so true, right? The things that we experience as humans shape our understanding. And so our first read of a story your first read of Jurassic Park, you probably didn't understand the science. I did not. You probably were just this is cool. There are dinosaurs and a mosquito and I'm in it.
I did appreciate the DNA pictures that they put in the book, right? So I could track how that all looked, but of course I did not understand what that meant. Yeah.
But as an adult, you can read it and you have some more foundational knowledge and you've taken a biology class and you're this probably wouldn't work. But you're
hey, don't kill the dream, all right?
Okay,
don't kill the dream.
The dinosaurs are going to come back. But, just this idea of as we grow, as we develop, as we experience things, our understanding of everything is going to change. And so I think repeat reading is so fundamental. Like, I go back to Harry Potter, I go back to Wuthering Heights, and the way I felt about the main characters in Wuthering Heights, as like a 17-year-old little lovesick girl is completely different than a 40-year-old woman. Now I'm like, that's red flag alarms here. But but I still think there's a beauty in it, right? And like there's a reason why that has lasted over time. And so, and I think it's okay to repeat read things. Like I think sometimes in society, people feel like, oh, I just can't, I shouldn't reread that. And one of my participants is like, I hardly ever repeat read because there are so many new options. But occasionally something will strike her fancy and she'll reread it. And I think that there is, it's important when you repeat read. You're searching for something when you go back to a story. And I do think you're absolutely right. My husband and I read a very famous book. I don't know, can I say it? So he read The Fourth Wing, thinking it was like a dragon series, and he was like, I'm reading this book, but there's like some weird romance in it. And he's like, but I'm all in because the fantasy and like the dragons. And I was like, that's cool, Christopher. And and then like 3 months later, it had been recommended to me like 10 times. And I was like, okay, I'll try it. And he was like, are you reading The Fourth Wing? And I was like, yeah, I am. And he's like, I said, but I think we're reading for different reasons. Like, I love the dragons and stuff, but I'm like, I'm also all in on this romance. I'm like, are they going to end up together? Is this enemies to lovers? Like, what's happening? You know what I mean? So I do think, but it was interesting to even have us have conversations about that series. And then we even had conversations of like, when would our daughter be able to read this? And like, I think that it's interesting when you explore things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And sharing that, like passing those stories down, like your favorite stories, maybe not that one, but your favorite stories of, oh, here, read this. I remember reading it when I was a child. And that's what I'm doing now, right? Like all of those favorite classics or Charlotte's Web or like, here, let's read this one together. My husband has my daughter, well, they're reading together The Young Indiana Jones.
Oh, yeah.
And we really thought she would not be into this, but she loves it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's that bonding, though, that experience that's adding on to the love of the book and giving her those memories that when she's a parent, she'll be able to pass those traditions on.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and it's funny when you say like experiencing something when you're young and thinking, oh, this is really cool, and then re-experiencing it as an adult. The quote unquote best example I can give of this is have either of you seen Bedknobs and Broomsticks, the movie?
No.
I think it's a Disney movie, but it was made, 60s, 70s or something. But for some reason when I was a kid, I loved it, and I think I was only remembering like a 30-second section of the movie that like anytime I would think about it as I grew up, like, oh, that was really cool because I remember that one part and that was awesome. I revisited it after I had kids, and let me tell you, it was not all I had thought it was. So not a bad movie by any means, but definitely not as one as an adult I would maybe recommend to sit through again. There's like this 7-minute song like in the middle of it that comes out of nowhere, and you're like, wow, this song's still going. So anyway, it is cool seeing like, what you think as a kid and then what you think as an adult when revisiting the same kind of thing. And also going back to, not wanting to revisit books is like an interesting thought to me, because when it comes to TV shows or even just like YouTube clips or something, people revisit the same thing over and over again, right? Like how many times have I watched through the entire series of Lost? I don't know, but it's more than one, right? But again, like when I think about why do I do it, it's because of the characters, it's because of the world building, it's because of like all of these like archetypal characters that I can relate to in one way or another, which is, your basic building blocks for telling stories, right? And, so when you relate it to books or relate it to any type of storytelling, that's kind of what keeps you going back, is you being able to relate to those kind of things. So really, really cool conversation. I love talking about all this. But we are kind of coming to the end of the conversation, though, so I did want to just ask both of you if there's anything else that you want to add to the conversation that you don't think that we've been able to touch on quite yet.
I would say just, for caregivers, because I'm going to focus on the youth component, just to remember that it goes by so fast. our kids grow up so fast. So take the time and enjoy a good book with your child. Your teenager is going to enjoy it. Read aloud together. That is so fun as a family. Having your teenager reading to the 5-year-old or, it's a great bonding time. So just bond over a good book and visit PPLD. If you can't make it to a library, ppld.org. And we have all your resources and you can read and have a good family time.
Yeah, I think for me, it's, I encourage everybody to go find a book. So and if you don't know what to find, talk to somebody about the kinds of books that they are enjoying. Because I think there is magic in literature, and you can listen to an audiobook on your car ride. You can do it on your road trip over the summer vacation. There are lots of opportunities for you to engage in a different way, and there is magic in storytelling. And so taking the time to find that sometimes can be rocky, right? Like the first book you pick up might not be the best book, but find somebody who who's an avid reader and say, what have you read recently? This is the kind of stuff I like. And sometimes even just basing that on the types of television you watch or the types of news articles you read, I think sometimes that can help also get you in the right genre, because there are so many now that you can find something that's a good fit for you. And I think just taking the time to understand that reading has lots of forms in our digital era, and it doesn't just mean sitting down with a paper book. And it could be that for you, but it could also take a lot of different ways. And like I said earlier, not being afraid to stop a book. If it doesn't, if it's not the right fit, it's not the right fit, and find the right fit for you. And I think my biggest thing is, I just had a former student stop me in the grocery store, and she graduated 3 years ago, so I probably had her 9.5 years ago, 10 years ago. And I said, what have you been reading? Because that's what I always ask my former students. And, she told me she's in college, and so she hasn't had a lot of time. I said, well, what's your favorite thing you ever read? And she's like, the book that you gave me in 8th grade. And I just was floored. There's a power in helping kids find that, and there's a lasting impact. And I think if you want your children to read, as parents, you have to read as well. Yes. And it's important that we show a time in that, and that you make time in your day. Like, take 20 minutes, and everybody reads for 20 minutes, and the impact will be profound for everybody.
And even if it's the same book over and over again.
Yeah, even if it's a graphic novel. Graphic novels are actually, there's a whole bunch of research about how actually they engage a different part of your brain, and they're actually very challenging and great for readers. But let them read what they want to read within reason, right? But, have conversations with your kids about your books.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for being here, Jervaise and Melody. Thank you for taking the time. I appreciate all of the work that you guys are doing, and everything that storytelling does for the community. So thank you for being a part of the conversation today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you are interested in listening to additional episodes of Beyond the Dais, be sure to look for us on Podbean or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.